Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Audubon chapter of Minneapolis October program, Birds, Birders, Birding, Connecting People and Places. I'm Marian, and I am the chair of Audubon chapter of Minneapolis. We are very proud to be able to provide free programs to the public, thanks to generous donations from our audience. If you have been enjoying our programs, we invite you to consider becoming a member or donating to our chapter by going to our website, minneapolisaudubon.org/get-involved. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to enter them using the Q&A function below on your Zoom screen. We will field as many questions as time allows at the conclusion of the presentation. Tonight, I am very pleased and honored to introduce our presenter, Deja Perkins. Deja is a PhD student at North Carolina State University studying geospatial analytics. She is an urban ecologist and an advocate for people exploring nature in their neighborhoods. Deja is especially interested in the intersection of environmental justice and conservation, looking deeper at how environmental and social justice issues impact wildlife and how people value the environment. In 2020, Deja helped launch #BlackBirders Week, a social media movement that aims to highlight Black bird watchers, naturalists, and outdoor enthusiasts. She also co-founded the Black AF in STEM collective, which seeks to uplift, support, and amplify Black STEM professionals in natural resources and the environment through professional development, career connection, and community engagement. And so without further ado, I will hand the mic over to Deja, and I hope you give her a very warm but silent welcome as she gives her talk. Thanks, Deja.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And hello, everyone out there in the audience. Thank you so much for attending today's talk, virtual, live, not really in person. And to all the future viewers out there, thank you for viewing this program. And with that, I will share a little bit of my work with you all, my journey, going from growing up in Chicago through my research journey and the work that I'm doing today. So tonight I'll be talking to you all about birds, birders, and birding and how that connects people and places. First of all, who am I? I am a geospatial analytics PhD student, and I'm also a member of the Ideal Participatory Science Working Group. I'm one of the organizers, but I also identify as a birder. I'm a local bird guide and help to introduce people to birding all around the Triangle of North Carolina and really throughout the Southeast and the Midwest. But I'm also an educator, and I've taught special guest lectures and special labs, introducing students to a variety of methods for bird surveying and thinking about our urban environment. On top of that, I've partnered with a variety of organizations, including the National Wildlife Federation, BirdNote, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and some of our local organizations here in North Carolina. My story begins in the very large city of Chicago. I grew up in a very urban environment, not necessarily downtown Chicago, but about 20 minutes from downtown Chicago. And so I wasn't really exposed to wildlife growing up. My experience growing up, my local park was a recreational park. It was a park for sports. And so my experiences with wildlife growing up, well, with nature in general growing up, was playing tennis outside at the park or playing on the playground. And at that point in my life, the only value that I saw for trees was shade in nature. And like I said, didn't really have a lot of exposure growing up to wildlife. I thought that Canada geese were the end all be all for birds. These were the birds that I saw all the time. I thought they were amazing. I had no idea that there were over 10,000 species of birds across the world. But I was fascinated with animals nonetheless. And so I tried to participate in a variety of different programs that would give me a little bit of exposure. Most of my exposure growing up was through books. It was through watching Animal Planet. But when I was in high school, I started to find a few different programs that allowed me exposure to learning about my natural environment. Programs like the Fishing Buddies Inc. program, which exposed me to the natural areas in Chicago. And eventually, as I got older, I became a leader for this program. But I also participated in some of the programs at the Shed Aquarium, where we did a marine biology program in the Bahamas. And so for a long time, I thought I was going to be a marine biologist or veterinarian. I had no thought about working with birds at all in my mind. So like I said, I wanted to be a veterinarian, and I decided that going to a historically Black college and university was the fit for me. I ended up getting a full ride to Tuskegee University, which they graduate they're the number one school to graduate Black veterinarians in the entire nation. And so I thought I wanted to be a veterinarian and was pursuing my degree in animal science. And my misconception when I got to the university was that I would be working with wild and domestic animals to prepare me for vet school. But the reality was I was learning a lot about the production and management of farm animals. And so my first year of undergrad was a little bit miserable, moving from the big city of Chicago down to the very rural town of Tuskegee, Alabama, and working with farm animals. And so I found a volunteer opportunity at the nearby Auburn University at their Raptor Rehabilitation Center, where I was an education intern / volunteer. So I was able to work with a variety of different birds of prey and talk with the public about them. And of course, the only reason why I did this was because I wanted to be able to hold these very powerful animals on my arm. And the lure of being able to feed them and train them was amazing. And I think this is part of where my love for birds was sparked. And I had to figure out a way to work with birds more after that. And so I ended up applying for an internship with the Student Conservation Association. They had a career discovery internship program where they allow students from diverse backgrounds these opportunities, a paid opportunity to work at refuges across the US. And so I was placed, there I am in the corner, I was placed at Minnesota Valley National Wildlife Refuge as a visitor services intern. So I did a lot of educational programming, working with kids and interacting with the visitors there. And so this was really my first time really being exposed to a wide variety of bird species. Things like seeing the wild turkeys walk around outside the visitor center every day, getting to see bald eagles flying over my head for the first time was a moment that still, I think eagles still inspire me today, and I catch my breath every time I see one. Being able to see the interactions between songbirds and smaller birds like blue jays with more predatory birds like the Cooper's hawk, and watching the Cooper's hawk fly into the feeder and learning how to hunt. Those were really exciting moments for me that not only instilled my love and curiosity for birds, but it was also a way for me to connect with the visitors at the center. So I wasn't from Minnesota, but I definitely I definitely had grown up in the Midwest, but I wasn't really familiar with the landscape or all of the resources that the refuge had to offer. So my experience there working with birds, that was, talking with people about birds, that really opened my eyes to a whole new world. And ever since that internship, I have been seeing birds everywhere. It was almost like I had blinders on before I was introduced to birds. And then after I left Minnesota, I could not stop seeing birds everywhere that I went. And so I didn't know many of these species at the time, aside from like the red-bellied woodpecker, which I had seen all the time at the feeders, or the great blue heron, which is a very common bird down in Alabama, seeing, near wetlands. but I would see birds like soras and cedar waxwing when walking out of class one day. And so I would just begin to take pictures of these birds. And even when I didn't know what they were, I was still had an appreciation for how beautiful these birds were. And so after that, I was hooked. I had to find every opportunity that I could to study and learn more about birds and get as much experience as I could to be able to build a career around birds. And so because I had to do paid internships, I'm a first generation college student. So I had to find paid internships so that I can make sure that I can pay my way through school the following years. And so I didn't always get a chance to work with birds. At some point I had worked with bees and studying urban agriculture. But I always found my way into urban nature or back to wildlife at some point. In some of these photos here, working with USDA APHIS Wildlife Research Station, looking at bird predation and its impact to farmers, catfish farmers in the South, or the experiences that I had in grad school working with Audubon, North Carolina, and getting able to learn a little bit more about coastal biology. And so I knew throughout those experiences that I did not want to do animal science anymore. And so I switched to a 3+1 program at my school, where I spent 3 years at Tuskegee learning about natural resources. And I spent my last year at Mississippi State learning the different skills that I needed to become a wildlife biologist. And that was where I got a chance to work with USDA APHIS. But I ended up graduating from Tuskegee with my Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science, Natural Resources, and Plant Sciences with a wildlife conservation concentration. After this program, I decided that I was a little bit done working in rural environments and I wanted to move back into the city, and an opportunity at NC State opened up for me. And I think that my experience at NC State in my master's program was when I really became a birder. So we're moving into part 2, becoming a birder from field biologist to geospatial researcher. During my master's program, I worked with the Triangle Bird Count, which is a small citizen science project here in the Triangle of North Carolina, started by my master's advisor, Dr. Madhu Kati, where we were exploring the bird diversity across 5 cities in the Triangle region. So I was getting up every morning during the time of April through May, looking for birds in residential neighborhoods, in park spaces, along the side of the road. So I was surveying birds in a variety of different habitats across a variety of different income groups. And it was through this project that I realized that people love birds. I had no idea that there are 66.1 million Americans over the age of 16 who are just fascinated by birds and participate in bird watching. And this is just from 2004. And so through the Triangle Bird Count, I received my first pair of binoculars and I started working with people and engaging people with birds, teaching people about how to ID the common bird species in their yards, and encouraging people to sign up and count birds with me. And I realized that not only do people love birds, we feed them, we take pictures of them, we paint them, watch them, and we monitor and protect them. So we are obsessed with birds, and I can see why. They're beautiful. And birders contribute so much to the economy. This report is from the 2016 U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, U.S. Census Bureau, U.S. Census Bureau survey of fishing, hunting, and wildlife-related recreation. And so, as you can see, birders contribute. They say wildlife watching, but you can see from this graph here that birders are 88% of that amount. And so we contribute almost $80 billion to the economy yearly. And I'm pretty sure it's more now. This is back in 2016. But not only do we do our best to contribute to the economy, we also contribute to conservation. If we utilize apps like eBird or work on local smaller scale projects. But through our contributions to eBird, scientists, researchers can use that data to make inferences about migration, to look at conservation. They can list birds on the IUCN Red List. There's so much information that can be done when we contribute our data to eBird. And so through all of this learning experience, I learned that location matters. Where we go birding matters. And so this is a little bit of the unpublished research from my master's project, where I examined not only did the surveys in the Triangle of North Carolina, but also examining similar methods in Tucson, Arizona, and Fresno, California, where they all had local bird count surveys. And I compared that method to eBird. And so one of the things that I noticed is that, which we can really clearly see here on these maps, where eBird data is on the left, all those blue points are the observation points and where people are going birding. And on the right are the places where they were observing birds with the Tucson bird count. Now, upon first glance, you can tell that there, number one, are way more points on the right side with the Tucson bird count. But not only that, they have so much more coverage within the urban landscape. So we're looking within this black outline here. And that's the city limits of Tucson, Arizona. And I created this bivariate map to look at the relationship between wealth and richness in this location. And so the areas with the most amount of the darker green, that's high wealth. Areas with darker purple, it's high richness. And then the areas along the gray scale are where there's both wealth and richness, or lack of wealth and richness. And so one of the main things that we can see at first glance is that outside of the Black border, we have these larger blocks of land. These are more rural areas, more rural census tracts. And we see that there's higher richness in some areas, and that's where we get most of our richness from. But there are also areas where there's high wealth and high richness. And then there are areas that are high wealth. But once we look inside of the city limits of Tucson, we start to see that there is more, in some places further away from the city, there's high richness. But there are also, that's where a lot of the instances of bird watching are occurring. But then once we start to get to these really tiny urban census tracts, the really small squares, we notice that a lot of them start to become that lightest of gray color, where we don't have any data on richness. And then that is really important because it impacts whose information are we looking at? Where are we collecting data about birds? And so it's not only in these more rural areas where there's known high richness that we should go birding, but also within the urban city limits so that we can collect data in these areas. And the one great thing about the Tucson bird count is that it does collect data from all of these areas. Now, I would like to mention that this is more of a small scale project, right? This is a project that occurred within one city, similar protocols in different cities. But through my current research, we're also looking at where eBird observations are occurring across the US, so nationwide. And through this analysis, we've been able to see a couple of things. So here we have these different lines that are colored based on percentage of Black, Indigenous, people of color So basically a lumped category of everybody who's non-white. And so we can see that in tracts that are 80 to 100% BIPOC, they are very low in the amount of census tracts that have at least one observation. So that means there's at least one place where someone has gone birding. But then if we look at the opposite end of the spectrum of those locations, census tracts that are less than 20% BIPOC or majority white, we can see that they have a lot more tracts with observations, and even across all income levels. We have this interesting dip here at 25 to 35K, but overall, census tracts that have fewer BIPOC individuals have a higher portion of tracts with at least one eBird observation. So what does that tell us? That means that people are mostly going birding in high income neighborhoods. So this led me to believe that how we collect data is just as important as the data we are collecting. So it started to make me wonder about questions as who is going birding? Where are we going birding? And why are we not seeing people represented across all ethnicities? Because the US is a big melting pot of individuals from everywhere across all ethnicities. And so with this, there's some research out there, so we know that the urban landscape is diverse, and our data should be too. We know that there are historical patterns and social structures that shape the landscape. This has been a very popular figure going around in academic circles. Is the paper by Christopher Schell et al. In 2020, where he found out that there are systemic biases that we have that influence our landscape and our society and our structure. So our personal systemic biases influence our thoughts on law enforcement, residential segregation, where resources are allocated, employment rights, immigration policy, gentrification, and all of those things influence where we find impervious surface on the landscape, and where urban heat islands are clustered, and where we find a lot of green space and trees and tree cover, where environmental pollutants are clustered on the landscape, where resources occur across the landscape, how diseases move through the landscape. And all of those things are filters that affect the ecological and evolutionary patterns and processes that researchers study, that people notice in their everyday lives. We know that from aerial images that nature is different in different parts of the city. Now, these are two images from Chicago, and these neighborhoods are not very far from each other. They're probably about a 5-10 minute drive down the same street from each other, but you can clearly see that there's a difference in tree canopy cover. Now the Woodlawn area is kind of near where I grew up, not a lot of tree cover, and probably not a lot of birds, versus the Chicago, the Hyde Park area is at some place that I always wanted to live growing up, just because of, how many beautiful trees they had, and there was nature and greenery everywhere. But the two communities differ in their demographics as well. The Woodlawn area is predominantly Black, and the Hyde Park area is predominantly white. And then when we look at birder demographics in general, and this is from a 2013 paper, but a 2011 study, we see that birders generally have higher income, and they are more female than they are male, and that birders are typically 55 and up, so they're mostly retired. But I am very happy to see with my own eyes that these demographics are changing slowly, but they're definitely changing. But a 2022 study by my lab mate where he surveyed members of the Christmas bird count and found that 96% of respondents were white. So things are changing, but they're not really changing. Birding is still overwhelmingly white. And this is important because of the questions that we think of that, when we are going birding or doing research. It's important because of where we decide to go birding. And we see that this demographic, this difference in demographics is not just with bird-based projects. It's also occurring in other types of environmental contributory projects. And so this is a study from 2020 with Riverwatch, which is a water monitoring based project, where they surveyed their own demographics. They did an internal survey of their participants and found that their participants were overwhelmingly non-Hispanic white, and that they had very poor representation of all of the other ethnicities. But when comparing that to the broader demographics of Illinois, they found that there was a difference in who actually lives in Illinois, and that there are more ethnicities that could be represented within their projects. So my work now as a PhD student, I'm examining large-scale participatory projects with my lab at NC State University, where we do public science work. So we do our research, but we also focus on how we communicate to the public. But I'm also within the Center for Geospatial Analytics. So I look at, that's that large scale portion. And so I'm looking at projects like eBird, iNaturalist, a project called Coco Ross, which is the community collaborative rain, hail, and snow network, and projects like Falling Fruit, which help to look at urban foraging patterns. So these projects are all important in terms of biodiversity, flood risk, and precipitation, as well as who has access to free food. And so let's take a quick look at what even participatory methods can mean. They can be large scale with projects like Philo, which looks at the human genome. They can be small scale, like projects, small scale bird survey projects like the Tucson bird count. They can be digital projects like how Philo was embedded within Borderland. So they embedded the Genome Project within a digital game to allow gamers, and it's kind of like a mini side quest, and they're able to help code these genome sequences by matching things, by matching these puzzles within the game. But they can also be in-person projects like astronomers or weather monitors or even birders. They can be across the disciplines. We see these types of projects within human genome, biology, mapping, and even storytelling in digital humanities. But these projects also occur across boundaries. So there are citizen science associations in Europe, in Africa, Australia, and as well as here in the US. But I would like to take a moment just to recognize that citizen science is not community science. These are two separate structures, two separate existing project structures. Citizen science tends to be geographically dispersed, so these are large-scale projects. They are focused on a community of interest. So let's say maybe people who like nature or people who like coding. There is an internet communication. So a lot of the communication will be digital, where you don't really get to know the project participants. And there's massive participation. And a lot of the participation is surrounded by data collection. Versus community science, these are projects that are more local, that are a community surrounded about a community of place. There's a lot of face-to-face communication, and there are a few core people who are involved in the process, and they ensure that those people are incorporated in every step of the scientific process, not just data collection. And these topics can look like within citizen science, they can be for leisurely pursuit. I've heard of citizen science being called I've heard of citizen science being called extracurricular science. And so, just something that you do in your free time because you like science and it's fun. These are projects that can be curiosity driven surrounding nature conservation. But the most important thing is that the projects are usually created by, the goals are driven by an institution. And the goal is usually to publish that information. Whereas with community science, the goals are more so actionable science, and the topics are more so about concerns for that community of place. The topics often are surrounded by environmental justice issues because they want to gather data in order to create action and pursue legal action about things that are harming their community. And so some of the topics that we've seen throughout citizen science is that the climate is changing, looking at monarch butterfly migration, looking at the impact of ladybugs, looking at things like the genetic population structure of sea turtles. Whereas with community science, we see topics that are more so surrounded by environmental justice. So looking at things like air pollution and how it disproportionately affects communities of color. Looking at CAPA locations, and that specifically referring to hog farms and hog waste in North Carolina. Looking at truck routes and how that's linked to elevated asthma, or looking at the noncompliance of chemical industry causes. So there are a lot of differences in the topics of these two types of projects. Not only there's a difference in the projects, but there's also a difference in the structure and how these projects are done. And so my advisor, Dr. Karen Cooper, led a paper defending the term community science and wanting to ensure that people know more about the fact that it is a pre-existing term and a body of work that is primarily driven by minorities, primarily around topics of environmental justice. And so really thinking about the whole conundrum of rebranding citizen science and recognizing that that term has been exclusive to a lot of people because of the way that citizenship is looked at in our country, but also recognizing that this is an international term and that it's never a good practice to not co-op, I can't think of the word, but take over a pre-existing term, especially one that is primarily driven by minority-led research. And so one of the things that I've been interested in looking at are the barriers to participation in these types of projects. And so we conducted a Qualtrics survey, which had about 1,800 participants. And we asked them questions like, how do they feel about participatory science and contributing to science? And so we asked them questions like, do these things align with your values? Do you fear the negative consequences? Do you lack support? Does the lack of diversity in science activities prevent you from participating? Participating is not fun for you. The science activities won't help you address the problems that you care about. They're not designed for people like you. You don't feel welcome. You're not interested in doing science activities. Your participation won't make a difference. No skills or abilities to do science well. You don't have people to participate with. You lack free time. You're not aware of our opportunities to participate. You're never invited to engage in science activities. There is no access to these opportunities, and lacking training needed to do science activities and the cost of these activities being too high. And so, or lacking technological resources to participate in these types of activities. So through a factor analysis and some more fancy statistical things, I was able to group these into two groups, one being personal barriers. And so a factor analysis is just a fancy way of trying to figure out what items relate to each other. So we were able to figure out that there were two categories, one of personal barriers and one of structural barriers. And so personal barriers are things that you can't really change, but structural barriers are things that you can probably change about your project, like the cost of the activity or the training that you can provide for an activity or the access or where you advertise these activities. Those are things that a project can change. But then there are some things like not being interested in science or lacking the free time to participate. Those are things that a project or a program can't change. And those are people that they will never really be able to access. But then when looking at this part, the barriers perceptions by race, we see that those who identify as white, they definitely perceive fewer barriers than BIPOC individuals. And that's on both personal and structural barriers. And when looking at that perception by citizenship status, we see that non-citizens perceive higher barriers than both, non-citizens perceive higher barriers in both personal and structural barriers. So there's clearly some sort of difference in how people are perceiving these programs. And so that kind of moves me to part 3. And that's the last phase of my PhD program, which is examining how we can build authentic partnerships and exploring better engagement. And that leads me to the work that I'm doing with the Ideal Participatory Science Working Group. We've received a grant from NSF to look at inclusive practices within participatory science. And so we are working with a variety of scholars and practitioners and graduate students in order to investigate how can we be better? How can we better serve people? How can we better engage people? And what exactly are we missing when it comes to these projects that might be excluding people? And so what does it mean to be ideal? Well, first, it means being inclusive, intentionally creating power structures where individuals feel safe, welcome, supported, valued, and respected to participate. And most importantly, they feel like they can make decisions as their authentic selves. They don't feel like they have to code switch or they have to be a different person in your presence. It means being diverse, having a wide variety of people visible and having their social affiliations, ethnic backgrounds, ideological orientations within the practice. It means being equitable, having practices that recognize the current and legacy disparities and support differently based on those disparities. It means being accessible, and so thinking about the degree to which these projects can be used effectively for a person without a disability, as a person with a disability or a special need. And it also means being large scale. So we've seen that these community science projects, these smaller scale projects do it right. They're more inclusive, they have more diverse participation, they lead to actionable science. So how can we take some of the practices of community science and incorporate that into larger scale projects that take on, that are more institution driven, that are geographically dispersed? How can we adopt some of those practices? And so we've come up with this recipe for success, which really involves centering in the margins. And I think that this can also be applied to building better programs. And so first you can kind of look at personal change and individual change. And that is related to your position in your relation and how you relate to others. And so it's examining where you lie within the power structure of society and how different aspects of your existence may put you within or outside the margins. But it also means doing a diversity audit and looking at who's present within your program and who's missing. But then there are things that we can do project-wide to create change. Things like having more representation, building equitable partnerships, thinking about who sits on our boards, thinking about who we hire and who gets promoted through different programs. and thinking about how we prioritize different narratives. And so whose narrative are we sharing when we are building our programming and building our outings? And it also means thinking more about field safety and how people have different experiences and and what extra precautions may need to be taken depending on someone's identity. But it also means localization and building capacity, either across programs or building capacity outwards. And so the next steps are really applying this knowledge to improve our data and to improve our programming. And that starts for me with community engagement. And so I have been working with the city of Raleigh over the past 2 years now to engage people in bird watching at a local urban park. You can hear the planes flying overhead, you can hear the traffic noise in the background and the sirens, but there is still a huge diversity of birds that can be found at this local park. And I have been engaging birders, mostly new birders, people who've never gone birding before, people across age, people across generations, across ethnic backgrounds, even across international, just with a wide geographic range, attend these walks and get familiar with not only the birds in our neighborhood, but also the process of contributing to science and how they can take that back to their own neighborhoods. I've also been doing this through digital virtual campaigns like Black Birders Week. And so it started as something really out of a response and a reaction to the Central Park incident. But over the past few years, it's grown into this celebration, this way to highlight the Black birders that do exist and to share the joy that we find in birding and to connect and really to connect with each other, find a space to connect with each other in a time where face-to-face connection and community building wasn't really possible. And so we went from digital to in-person. And so this past year's Black Birders Week. And I was really excited because I was able to engage people and bring out new and existing birders. And it was just a joy to just experience going birding with people who look like me and to be able to teach people about the local resources that we had. And it was just, there was just so much joy during this event. And in 2021, we did a similar event with our hashtag Birds of a Feather Day, where we encourage people to go birding where they are. And so I went birding in Chicago, and this was actually my first all BIPOC bird walk. And so this just was an event that brought me so much joy because it was the first time that, I felt like I could truly be myself on a bird walk. And I was the expert in this situation. And I was introducing people to something that I loved. And I was really excited to see from a recent analysis that Black Birders Week has engaged people across borders. And so it wasn't something that just occurred in the US, but it was something that because it was through a virtual platform, we were able to engage with people in 54 countries across the world. And I felt like that was a huge accomplishment for something that was born out of pain and something that started out, with people who were early career STEM professionals. And so this was a huge accomplishment in my eyes. And so the last thing that I just kind of want to wrap up this presentation with is that, yes, birds are important, but the people we meet, the experiences we share, and the bonds we build are important too. Birds have taught me so much, and they have engaged me with a variety of different people, not only in the US, but across the world. And it's taught me that the way that we engage, connect, and build community with each other, whether digitally or in person and across generations, the mindfulness we take when we go birding can make all the difference. Not only when we are connecting with people, but when we are contributing to data. So thank you for listening and joining me this evening.
Thank you so much, Deja. We'll go ahead and take a couple minutes for questions. If anybody has questions or if they'd like to share a comment, go ahead and drop that into the Q&A function. Let's give a couple of minutes. This is really wonderful. Thank you so much.
I have a question while we're waiting. I can't answer my question into the chat. Is that okay if I ask a question, Katie?
Of course.
So Deja, on your slide, that was the maps of Tucson, Arizona, where you talked about the gaps in richness data. I was wondering, so sometimes when the birding community is having these bigger conversations about who is included in birding and who is not being included and who can be a birder and who can't, there are always some voices who say, let's just stick to birds. Like, let's leave that out of that. This is just about birding. And so what I kind of took away from that map is that there actually is sort of some scientific and data and conservation outcomes that can be linked to inequitable, those structural barriers to participation in citizen science. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about like maybe what the birds are losing out on when we don't have that richness data, and if you could talk a little bit more about why inclusion should be part of the conversation and when we talk about conservation and birds.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think that there are a few things that can be left out of the conversation when we leave it to just the birds. So like I said, the data from eBird can be used to make a wide range of management decisions. And when we don't have data across all income levels and across all neighborhood types, then we could be missing important places, maybe for restoration, or important places that could be designated for a migratory hotspot, like an important migratory stopover location. So we're missing those elements. But I always like to say that it's not just about the birds, like it's also about the people. And so when we don't have when we don't have that information and we don't have those locations for people to engage with birds, we're really doing a disservice to the people and people that live in that community of place. And so like I said, I had no knowledge about birds or the world of birding until I got to grad school. And so I just kind of think about the opportunities that I may have had and the things that I may have been able to do if I had been introduced to birds and birding at a younger age. Like the friendships I could have made, the opportunities to travel and go see things. Like I know there are a lot of programs and different places that help to expose people to birds. There are birding festivals. Like I had no idea about any of those things. And so I think through Black Birders Week and even through my bird walks, I've seen that it's not just a matter of people not being interested in those types of things, because that's another argument that I've heard. It's like, oh, well, they're not participating because they're not interested. And that's not true. It's really just a matter of access and opportunity. And so not having access to those spaces, not having, any data in those areas, not having any programming in those areas, that is something that leads to that inequitable access and participation as well. So I hope that answered your question.
We have a couple of comments from some of the guests, letting you know that it was a wonderful presentation. They said, thank you so much for your research and your community engagement. Another one of the guests says, just a comment, it's so nice to hear about your work and to see another BIPOC birder. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for the wonderful comments, and thank you for coming. I'm so glad that you all enjoyed my presentation, and I hope to be able to make my way back up to Minnesota, maybe come birding again. When I first being that internship at the Minnesota Valley Wildlife Refuge, I was not a birder then, and I didn't appreciate it as much as I do now. So I would love to go back and visit and go birding with new friends and just kind of be more exposed, and see kind of like what I notice now that I, have my birding lens on, my binoculars on.
Absolutely. Anytime you let us know, and we would love to have you. We feel very, very lucky to live in the place where we do, being a river city, and having this incredible city with so much diversity in terms of like places to bird that are close to home and different types of habitat. And we're very, very lucky. So when you know that you're coming up this way, let us know. We would love to get out there and enjoy some birds and other wildlife with you.
Definitely, for sure.
Well, it looks.
Oh, I have one more question.
Yes, please go ahead.
Deja, if people are interested in following your advocacy work and maybe being inspired by your educational programs in North Carolina, or when you start to publish, find some answers to your research questions, how would people find you to learn more about your research or learn more about you?
Sure. So I will drop my social media handles in the chat. I share a lot of the work that I do. I'm at naturallywild __ on both Instagram and Twitter. On Twitter, I definitely share my research updates, and kind of the different things that I'm doing. And then on Instagram, I share more visuals of the research and the different types of things that I'm doing. So those would be the best way to keep in touch with me. You can always send me an email if there's anything else you want to chat about. I'll drop that in the chat as well. Oh, okay. And then I'll drop my social media. But I love to connect with other birders, so please do connect.
Great. I think that is it for the evening. I apologize if there's a screeching dinosaur in the background. I have a cockatoo and it is party time. But thank you again for a wonderful program. This was excellent. We really enjoyed having this opportunity to hear about the work that you're doing. And thank you so much for sharing this time with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a joy. And like I said, I really hope to be up in Minneapolis again soon.
Great. I think with that, we will bid everyone a good evening. And thank you again, Deja. We'll make sure to send you the link to the recording program. And hopefully we will be able to see you again and bird in the future.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Good night.